Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now at the hour of our death. Amen. Saint Michael the Archangel, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Oh, amen. It's showing here that it's recognizes the input because it's reformatted the resolution, but it's just not getting up there. Maybe just turn on and back off, on and off again. Okay. Yeah, it's okay.
Well, we can check and see if the clicker's working.
It's all right. Well, so this is the beginning of a series that Father Pat and I decided to do. Basically, it's going to consist of a class taking place about once a month. And this whole series, which will be, I presume, a perpetual series, is going to be called, or is called, we wanted a cool word, so of course we went for a Greek word, because you expect us to do Latin because we're Catholics, but we went for a Greek word. It's called, there's different ways to pronounce it, but I say mystagogy instead of goji. Say goji. If you want to be technical, you want to be a snob about it, is Omicron. This is Omega O, so this is an Omicron, not an O. This is your Greek letters here. This might just be too confusing. You can call it mystagogy, you can call it mystagogy, you can call it what you want. There we go.
Plug in all the way.
Oh, okay. And the reason why we chose this term after many long minutes of deliberation was because the term mystagogy, it's a Greek word, like I said, it's two words. There we go. It's two words broken or combined. It's musta or mista in Greek was where we get the word mystery from. And I'm not going to need this after this, yeah. And then gogu comes from the word like to walk. So the idea is that you're walking into the mystery. And the mystery that we're walking into is the truth of the Catholic faith. So the whole point of the whole series of talks that we'll do, he'll do, I'll do, other catechists or professors will come in and do, is that we're better expounding upon the faith that most of us, I suppose, have grown up with, or that we know maybe in some kind of pedestrian fashion, but want to kind of grow in like a deeper understanding of. This is the point of this whole series. So this is the first class in this series, and it's on Marian apparitions. And a full disclosure, I will not finish this class. I will not finish this. This will have to be at least a part 2. There is far too much to cover. I've only done, I only picked 5 apparitions, and that's Our Lady of Quito, or Our Lady of the Good Event, Our Lady of La Salette, Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Garabandal, Our Lady of Akita. Just those 5 alone. I have about 80 slides just for the first 2. So again, we will not finish. If you have any hopes of me covering more than 2, your hopes are dashed now. They're gone. There's no chance. If you've ever been to any talk I ever give, I never finish what I start for the most part. So, but I think, but here's why I don't personally mind taking tangential routes, and I don't think you do either. I guess you wouldn't come because you probably heard me talk before, but there's been a real serious crisis of education among Catholics in the past 60-ish years. And all in all, most Catholics just don't know anything. And it's not your fault. It's the priest's fault. And before it's their fault, it's like the seminaries that didn't train them sufficiently. It's their fault too. There was a kind of de-emphasis on intellectual formation back in the 60s and 70s in the seminaries. So a kind of shift away from apologetics or from catechesis or from even when you'd go to, if you went to seminary as a seminarian, someone who was in school to be a priest, you wouldn't learn even the same way that you would have learned 10 years ago. It used to be you'd learn, like Aquinas, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, who's the doctor of doctors, the Catholic faith, declared so by a pope as like the touchstone of Catholic faith. Aquinas was not in the books you have to buy for class for like 30 or 40 years, from about the 60s onward into the 90s, and really only just now, if you go to seminary, will you even read any portions of the Summa Theologia, for example, or any portions of Augustine, the Church Fathers, Gregory the Great, St. Basil, councils, reading the Council of Trent, the Council of Florence, all this stuff. Like this was all completely just off the table for a long time, or off the desk, you could say, for a long time. Therefore, if your priests aren't learning a lot in school, and they're not only not learning a lot, but they're told that it's not important to teach true things to the people, then you're just not going to learn much of anything. And it's really tragic because, as you heard in the gospel today, Christ said very emphatically to Philip, or really all the apostles at the Last Supper, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So you should want to know about the Catholic faith because the Catholic faith is true through and through because it's founded upon Jesus Christ, who is the capital T truth. That's the beauty of the faith, is that you can never stop going deeper into the mystery. The mystery is ever expansive before you. And you have the obligation upon yourself as an adult Catholic to educate yourself in, as a kind of coda to all that. You know, if you, as St. Augustine says, if you love someone, you want to know them. And when we talk about catechesis or doctrine or dogma, we're not talking about principally like words and syllogisms and propositions and ideas. We're talking about a person. St. Irenaeus said that the doctrine of the Catholic Church is Him. So what the Church says to be true about any article of faith is a further kind of revealing of Him. So if you want to love Jesus, you should naturally want to get to know Him better. So that's the point of this series. And one of the best ways to get to know Jesus is to get to know His mother. And Mary has appeared to us, really since about the 3rd century. The first kind of really notable Marian apparition that most people would know about is Mary appearing to Gregory the Great, Pope St. Gregory the Great. And she told Gregory the Great, I want you to build a basilica in my name. And that basilica still stands. Anyone know what it's called? Besides Steve? St. Mary Major in Rome. It still stands. Yeah, it's so pretty. It's a beautiful cathedral. So that's the most notable kind of first instance of Mary's appearing to a church official requesting something. And since then, there's been, well, as we'll see, numerous apparitions that have been reported. That's a long beginning for a talk that's already very long. So let's just get rolling. So at 2 o'clock, I'm just going to stop wherever I am, and we're going to take questions because I have a meeting at 2:30 that I have to have time before I can just jump into it. So at 2:15, 2:20, I have to go, just so you're aware. So don't feel like I'm avoiding you if I walk out. I have somewhere I have to be. Oop, oop. So here's what we'll cover. I have my clicker too, don't I? We'll cover these kind of general areas. The context, the historical context that situates the apparitions, the visionaries themselves, the message communicated by Mary. Sometimes when a Mary appears, she gives a general message, but then like a secret. So if there's any secrets, we'll talk about the secrets. It's the secrets that are meant to be revealed at a later time. So not at that time, hence why they're secret. And then a prophecy. Sometimes she'll give very specific prophecies. And sometimes you'll find the prophecy and the secret of the message kind of wrapped together. But if we come across like a very specific prophecy, like an historical date, historical figures, we'll pull those out and note them as well. Really because the prophecy is what gives substantial credence to the legitimacy of these apparitions. So a quick note about apparitions and visions in general. There's 3 different types. This is what all the spiritual masters, this is how they qualify apparitions and visions. One is called a corporal vision. Corporal comes from that word corpus, which means body, so it's a bodily vision. So it's actually something that's like out in front of you, like you're in front of me or I'm in front of you or this podium's in front of me. So it's external to your body. And likewise, it can be like a person that when they speak to you, like it, you could feel their breath, or if they touch you, you feel their hand on your shoulder or on your head. In some instances, a good sign, as I note here, is that, for example, when St. Francis of Assisi Stigmata, he sees this seraphim, I think, on a crucifix, and there's these beams shooting out of it, and it pierces his hands and his feet and his head and his side. And when the vision, the corporal vision's over, it leaves its mark. Or likewise, you might have burn marks on certain things. If a demon shows up and tries to burn your diary, if you're St. Faustina or St. Gemma Galgani, we have these things, we can see them now. So that's a corporal vision, so it's outside of you. Then there's what's called an imaginative vision. This means it's a vision that's interior. So here's an example. You're sitting down and you're praying the rosary, as you should, as we'll see, and you're meditating on the Last Supper. And, you're doing a pretty good job holding it in place. You've used the rosary for a long time. You know how to sit still and be quiet. You kind of have the habit of interior, recollective, meditative prayer. But then all of a sudden you're praying, and that image that you have starts to kind of animate itself. So it's not so much active on your part, but suddenly you become passive to another person operating in your imagination, manipulating the image. That's called an imaginative vision. Not terribly common, but not totally uncommon. The way that you know it's imaginative too is that, generally speaking, if you were to open your eyes, it would cease. So it's something it's something localized in your imaginative faculty itself. Here's 2 examples of what they can be like too. We have representative imaginative visions and also symbolic. Representative would be the Sacred Heart. So when St. Margaret Mary, is it Mary Margaret? Margaret Mary, I always flip that. Margaret Mary. Yeah, when she sees Jesus in the Sacred Heart, she sees him, or she sees his heart. It's weird, right? It's not literally real in a way. It is real, but it's a representation in an image of like a fuller kind of idea that really would only become unpacked really decades later. Or it's symbolic. Jacob's ladder, when Jacob sees a ladder with angels going up and down from heaven on this place. And that symbolizes to Jacob, this is the place to put an altar down, because this is a place, it's like a locus of holiness where God touches down on earth, which actually is the antiphon you use whenever you realm of dreams too, generally speaking. And the reason why dreams can be utilized by God more easily than if you're awake is because your imagination's totally passive, right? During the day, it's kind of on and off. You're imagining things as you're speaking, as you're talking with people, you're seeing things on TV, you're thinking about things. But at night, your imaginative faculty is totally at rest, it's totally passive, so God can more easily manipulate it. So that you could say that the dreams that Joseph had in the Gospels, those would have been representative, imaginative dreams. So it would have been the angels saying things to him and saying, do this, do this, do this, do this. And he knows it's not a normal dream. Another thing too, when it comes to dreams from God or from a demon, generally they're so distinct and lucid and they leave such a lasting effect that you know that they're just not quite natural. Barring you haven't eaten some, like bad meat the night before or something like that. Then we have intellectual visions. Intellectual visions, this is weird, These are, so when it's a perception of an object without the sensible knowledge. What does that mean? I've said this before in RCA, and I've said it here as well. You know things by looking at things. So in other words, knowledge comes through images of things, whether you know it or not. That's how you know things. So like you know like what chairs are by looking at like a bunch of chairs. So in this instance, you know in a different way. So instead of going from like particular chairs to other kinds of chairs to having this idea of a chair, you get the whole idea of what a chair is given to it once. So this is what we call angelic understanding too. So you don't pass from sensible knowledge of things to an idea, you just get the full idea. St. Teresa of Avila gives a nice example here. She says, we see nothing either interiorly or exteriorly. Don't see anything, okay? But without seeing anything, the soul conceives the object and feels whence or from where it is more clearly than if it saw it. If it sounds weird, it's because it is weird. Save that nothing in particular is shown to it. It's like feeling someone near one in a dark place. So what's really cool about this is what it reveals is that you have bodily senses and you also have spiritual senses. Because in this instance, there is no bodily thing, whether outside of you or a bodily faculty being used. It's something your soul is detecting. This we call, again, an intellective vision. They're extraordinarily rare, and people who have these are generally speaking in the unitive way, that last stage of holiness. So they're usually experiencing other mystical graces too, like ecstasy, for example. Or they're seeing other visions that are probably corporal as well. Most of the visionaries that we'll come across, interestingly enough, they're not always here. We tend to think that visionaries are people who are of apparitions, are people who are always like super mystics and holy and far advanced in spiritual life. It's not necessarily the case, as we'll see. They're people of average, we might say mediocre spiritual kind of growth, which is intentional. So here's some little notes about Marian apparitions. There's been over 10,000 reported since the history of the church. These are actually hard numbers to figure out. You might find different numbers online. It took me hours to get this one sentence. There's 10, more or less, that are approved by local ordinaries or local bishops. There's about 15 approved by the Holy See or the Vatican itself. The Vatican has said clearly that the local bishop is the guy who determines if it's legit or not. The Vatican does not have to intervene unless the bishop wants them to. But a local bishop is within his full authority to determine the legitimacy or illegitimacy of a vision, an apparition, any kind of private revelation that occurs in his diocese. So he doesn't need the Vatican to approve it. He can approve it himself. There have been 308 visions or apparitions received by saints or blesseds in the history of the church. So not all of these, think about, again, like Margaret Mary, like that's not something that, the church didn't go through each one of her apparitions and decide if they were formally like approved or not. They just approved the whole devotion. Or think about St. Louis de Montfort. Louis de Montfort had locutions, like he heard Mary speak to him. He saw Jesus, he saw St. Michael, but he's a saint and we don't really have any vested interest in having to go back through all of his apparitions and formally approve or disapprove all the locutions he had, all the visions that he had. But so many saints through the ages have seen Mary, seen Jesus, seen the angels and saints and talked to them. There's 3 types of decisions you can be given in regard to an apparition. So here are the 3. The first is constat de supernaturality. Established as supernatural. I've got Spanish and Italian in my head. I can't do that. Established as supernatural. That means that it's real. So if you get this ruling, it's real. Our Lady of Fatima is this category right here. This one's constat, established as not supernatural, meaning it's not real. There was one in the Philippines recently that was condemned. This is an apparition that's been condemned by the church and by the local ordinary. Then you have this third category, non-constat, meaning it has not been established as supernatural. So we're still waiting. We're not sure. This is Garabandal here. It fills this category. So again, established supernatural, like Our Lady of Fatima. Established as not supernatural, like Our Lady of, I forget what it's called, but I think it was tied to Mediatrix of All Graces, something like that. Not that that title's wrong, but it's just all the stuff that was around it was completely fabricated. Not supernatural. Then we have not established yet as supernatural. So we're still waiting for something to kind of come to fruition. This is important too before we get right into the apparitions. There's two different types of revelation. There's public revelation, there's private revelation. Public revelation consists of this. It's sacred scripture, sacred tradition, and it requires and demands assent by what we call divine and Catholic faith. So adherence to sacred tradition and sacred scripture is necessary for salvation. We know this. There are many things that you have to believe as a Catholic to call yourself a Catholic. You have to believe the Eucharist is fully God. You have to believe that the ministerial priesthood is real. You have to believe that Mary is immaculately conceived. If you don't believe in those things, you're not a Catholic. You don't have Catholic faith. It's one thing to wrestle with how to understand the details of those things, but to fully and obstinately deny them and reject them, you're not a Catholic. Then there's private revelation. Here's a quote from Pope Benedict XIV. Although an assent of Catholic faith may not be given to revelations thus approved, private revelations, still an assent of human faith made according to the rules of prudence determines what's right and what's wrong and when, is due to them. For according to these rules, and such revelations are probable and worthy of pious credence. So he's saying that if the ordinary or the Vatican deems an apparition to be true, they give it the stamp, they give it that first quality, that constat day of supernaturality, then it would make sense for you to believe in it and to follow it. That's what they're saying here. But adherence to it is not necessary for salvation. Private revelation also, it can't be contrary to the faith or to the Catholic teaching on morals. It is lawful to make it public. So it's because there's been no conflict found in the substance of what's been revealed, it therefore should be made public. And again, the faithful are authorized to recognize it with prudence. People can kind of go overboard with private revelation. I don't see it a ton, but you might get, for example, as we'll see, a lot of these apparitions deal with prophecies of great apostasy, chastisement, the second coming, the end of times, really kind of crazy stuff that's biblical, but stuff that's in greater detail. And what can happen can be you can plant yourself too firmly in the private revelation that you lose sight of the whole, you lose sight of the public, or you lose sight of the fact that your life is just meant to be like living a good, pious Catholic life, going to confession regularly, going to Mass, praying the rosary, following the precepts of the church, you name it. So you don't want to get too kind of wrapped up in this stuff or too hopeful that chastisement is coming soon. That can be a tendency too. So Marian apparitions, maybe for good reason, Marian apparitions are private revelation. They're not public revelation. So they don't detract from public, but they add to it and they kind of fill it out, but not in any kind of way that supplants it. So here we go. This is one that means a lot to me retrospectively, because the first time I went out of the country, I went to Ecuador. And actually, I guess the first city I went into off of a plane internationally was in the Quito in Ecuador. And I remember I got to tour this beautiful big church, and I had no clue where I was. I was like 20 years old or so, and let me make sure this kind of get a little hum. Didn't know where I was, but I remember picking up these cards with these images on it that looked really familiar. Or sorry, they didn't look familiar. They look familiar now, and I'll show you them as we go along. But little did I know that this card that I still have from 9-10 years ago is precisely related to Our Lady of Quito. And Our Lady of Quito, as you can see by the timeline, happened a long time ago. But what's really curious about Quito is the messages given to Venerable Mariana are messages for today, so almost 400 years before they were to be fulfilled. So here's some historical context. So our apparitions begin February 2nd, 1594. What is February 2nd? Feast of the Purification, also used to be called Candlemas, Candle Mass. This is because this is the feast day wherein you would bring all your candles to the priest, and the priest would bless them all. And this is tied to Simeon's prophecy that Christ would be a light to the nations. And you'd burn them in your home throughout the year. I mean, candle blessings are really cool because in a candle blessing you get an exorcism and a blessing attached to the candle. So candles principally have like the idea is that they literally dispel darkness. Therefore, it's very easy to understand how you could write a blessing wherein what they do is they exorcise evil spirits from where they're burned. So that's the idea of candles. They're supposed to be of pure beeswax. Used to be had to be 100% beeswax, which are kind of pricey, but they smell really nice. And what's also cool about 100% beeswax candles is that they're naturally kind of like they pull ions there, so they're good for you to burn them. It's just a kind of scientific fact. It's healthy for you to burn 100% beeswax candles in your home. So it's really nice when you have this nice lineup between how a thing, an element, or an object has a good physical effect or natural effect, but also tied to it a really good supernatural effect as well. A tradition that used to be commonplace that no one does anymore because, of course, when they revised the Mass and they revised the calendar, they got rid of this whole tradition of blessing candles. We don't have a vigil anymore of Candlemas. You can still do it, but it's been way toned down. And of course, all the exorcisms have been ripped out of the prayers like they did for everything else too, but whatever. If you want candles blessed, you can bring them by, and I'm happy to bless them anytime. But this starts on February 2nd, and it ends December 8th, which is Immaculate Conception, a good, 40 years later. So Ecuador was colonized by Spain around 1545, 1550. So the Spanish come over. This is part of that kind of New World enterprise. They come over down to South America, and they colonized Ecuador. Hence why we'll see Mariana was even there. The Spanish were sending missionaries to go down there and to evangelize the pagan people of Ecuador. Also at the same time, very significantly, the scientific revolution. This is the kind of total, what came to be a usurpation of our understanding of God's role in nature and in humanity itself. And we see the rise of humanism and secularism. Humanism basically is the claim that man is kind of the totality of all things, that there's no need for a transcendent God to give us intrinsic value. We give it to ourselves, which also leads to a kind of divinization of nature, because you got to have something to worship somewhere. So you find that paganism starts to kind of pick up in this era as well. And then what we call secularism, which is the heresy, or the claim again that the church and the state have no relation with each other, and man and civilization are better off if the church has nothing to do with it. If it sounds familiar, it's because it's one of the principles of our American founding. It's not good. It's condemned by the church. And it doesn't make any sense, but I won't go into that. It's not talking politics and philosophy. At this time also, Protestantism is spreading through all of Western Europe. The Reformation has happened. The Council of Trent is closed, which was meant to deal with Protestantism, but also meant to kind of beef up seminaries, reiterate teachings on the ministerial priesthood and the Mass, clean up any kind of aberrations that had happened in the Mass at that time in the Western Europe. So they kind of cleaned up all the missals and brought them into proper alignment with the Roman Missal. That happens in 1563. Just a few little notes to kind of get situated here what's going to happen. Here's our visionary. This is Mariana Francisca de Jesus Torres. In 1582, Mariana died. She was, I think, like 13 years old. She died. But when she died, she was given a vision where she was told by Jesus that if she wishes, she could continue to live as a victim soul for the sins that would occur in the 20th century, almost 500 years later. In 1588, not much longer after that, Mariana died again on Good Friday. And she was given a vision of the heresy and the sacrilege that would take place in the 20th century. So again, very strangely, Mariana's life is being defined by things that are so far away that they basically, are out of mind, out of sight. But this is what her life would be about. This is what her whole life would be for, is for calling to mind the sins that would come and then making reparation then for sins that would pass in the future. So as we see again, these messages principally concern the 19th and 20th centuries. Here's what I'm going to do is I've taken the messages from Quito. I can't do all of them because there's just so many. But I've taken the salient ones, or the really, I think, most relevant messages from what Mary told Mariana directly, and I've brought them here. What we'll do is we'll walk through it, and I will, as it seems fit, pick out certain things and explain them to you. So, here's our first quote from Mary to Mariana. Thus I make it known to you that from the end of the 19th century and from shortly after the middle of the 20th century, and what is today the colony, that's Ecuador, okay, it was colonized, and will then be the Republic of Ecuador. So here's a prophecy. She's already prophesizing that Ecuador will gain independence. The passions will erupt, and there will be a total corruption of customs. For Satan will reign almost completely by means of the Masonic sects. They will focus principally on the children in order to sustain this general corruption. Woe to the children of these times. What is Freemasonry? I get asked this all the time. Freemasonry is a secret society. All secret societies are de facto off limits to Catholics. Can't belong to a secret society. It's punishable by law, actually. It's by ecclesiastical law. It's grounds for excommunication from the Catholic Church. Can't belong to any secret societies. If you form like a little, like thing with your eight-year-old friends that you're like the band of brothers of whatever, of Sugar Creek neighborhood, that's whatever. That's not the end of the world, but this is like a formal society that like has oaths, rituals, vestments, funerary rites. It's very, it's a quasi-religion. It basically is a religion. Fraternities and sororities were founded by the Freemasons. They were meant to be ways that they could easily kind of funnel young adults into Freemasonic lodges, males and females. I didn't know that until like 2 years ago. But it's kind of strange because the history is just clear as day, which is why if you ever join I'm glad you asked this, Trip. It's why if you join a fraternity sorority, what do you do? Secret oaths, secret rituals. Sometimes you'll get some, cute ritual murder stuff. They'll make you lie down with a dagger or something. It's a very toned down form of more overt Freemasonic lodge stuff, but it's meant to be kind of a gateway into Freemasonry for young men and women.
So if you were in a fraternity, you need to go to confession?
My general rule of thumb, it never hurts. You could just say, you could say, Lester Fuller of Sin, 30 years ago, I was in a fraternity, I did these secret rituals. I didn't know any better, but I'm sorry I did that. You could say that if you want. I wouldn't presume anything's terribly wrong with you unless you start to have, if you have symptoms of oppression. I don't want to get too far into this, but if you start to have symptoms that would suggest that you're afflicted by it, then you should really go to confession. But most people do this stuff out of ignorance. I don't think anyone in this room knew what I just said. Right. So again, this is part of what I said at the beginning of the talk, which is part of my job as a priest is to warn you against things that are harmful to you, whether that makes you like me or not. If you liked your fraternity or sorority, that's fine. I'm not saying necessarily that they're evil through and through. I don't know many good things that come out of sororities or fraternities personally, being the one on the receiving end of the drain pipe when kids leave high school, go off to college, even for a year, and come back and haven't been to confession or mass in a year. It's always, and in every case, I'm speaking in absolute terms purposefully, tied to their involvement in some fraternity or sorority. I'm just saying. And it's duh. I mean, the whole idea is it's meant, they call them Greek life for a reason. What is Greco-Roman life? It's paganism. It's debauchery. It's drinking. It's sex. It's orgies. It's all that and worse. Okay, so Freemasonry was condemned by the church soon after it was founded in 1738. I think it was Clement IV. I might be wrong about that. It's been condemned by so many popes and so many documents that I'd fill up pages just listing the names of the documents and the popes, so I didn't do it. But here's what Pope Leo said. Pope Leo lived This is like the late 1900s, very beginning of the 20th century. The ultimate and principal aim of Masonry, from Freemasonry, was to destroy to its very foundations any civil or religious order established throughout Christendom, which is gone now, by the way, and bring about in its place a new order, a novus ordo, founded on laws drawn out of the entrails of naturalism. Very vivid language. Entrails meaning the bowels of naturalism. What's naturalism? Naturalism is essentially paganism. It's the worship of nature itself, which if you've ever been involved in a Masonic lodge, you've done the rituals, it's very clear the higher that you climb, especially as you reach the 31st, 32nd, 33rd degree, that you're putting yourself, you're kind of allying yourself with gods of demons of nature, of demon gods and gods associated with nature. For example, one of the things written on the cross is the INRI, right? Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. Well, the Freemasons, they're weird. They're kind of like synchronistic. They interpret INRI as, let me get it right in my Latin first. The fire of nature renews all things. If you spell it out, and if you write it out in Latin, that's what they mean. So it's like this kind of worship, this supplanting of Christ, of God itself, a personal God for nature. Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, he said this as prefect for the CDF. This is recent. Faithful who enroll in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion. So you're excommunicated, you're cut off. The Church's negative judgment in regard to Masonic associations remains unchanged since their principles have always been considered irreconcilable with the doctrine of the Church, and therefore membership in them remains forbidden. The Freemasons were established principally to, it's in their writing, this isn't like clickbaity stuff, to infiltrate the Catholic Church principally and reform it from within, because they knew that the Catholic Church was the church. So they knew that if they could get a grip in the Catholic Church, which still had some standing in the 1700s, they could reform the church and culture itself based off a kind of humanistic religion, where they worshiped God not as Yahweh or as Jesus Christ, but God as the supreme architect. He's this deistic God that's separate from his creation, has no real interest in you, and essentially they wanted to establish a one world order in doing so. There's a really good book, I meant to put this on here, called Murder in the 33rd Degree. Murder in the 33rd Degree, written by Monsignor Charles Murr, M-U-R-R. Eerie. And in that book, Charles Murr, Father Murr, talks about how when he was the secretary of a cardinal named Cardinal Gagnon, a Frenchman, Gagnon was appointed by the Pope to investigate if there were Freemasons working in the Curia, in the Vatican offices. Gagnon did the investigation. His apartment was ransacked on numerous occasions, documents stolen. There were attempts on his life because it came out with the data that was clear as day. Yes, Holy Father, there are Freemasons, there are priests who work for you, monsignors, cardinals, bishops who work for you who are Freemasons. I think it was all the way up to John Paul II. Gagnon has the report in hand saying, do something about this. And they didn't want to touch it. Gagnon was so frustrated that he's like, I can't do this anymore. He leaves the Vatican. I think he goes back to Africa and just goes back to his mission work in Africa. So this is just historical fact. This isn't, again, this might have been conspiratorial in a very clickbaity way 20 years ago or so, or 30 years ago, but this is just, the evidence for this is just irrefutable. Again, the book is called Murder in the 33rd Degree by Charles Murr, M-U-R-R. Very easy read, great book. All right. Holy Communion. Alas, how deeply I grieve to manifest to you the many enormous sacrileges, both public as well as secret, that will occur from profanation of the Holy Eucharist. Often during this epoch, the enemies of Jesus Christ, instigated by the devil, will steal consecrated hosts from the churches so that they might profane the Eucharistic species. My most holy Son will see himself cast upon the ground and trampled upon by filthy feet. Whenever you read prophecy, is that the AC? What is that?
That's the layer.
Yeah. It's very ominous. Whenever you read prophecy, prophecy is always multi-layered. So what tends to do this, it tends to apply in the historical now in which it's delivered, the 1600s, but also apply to other historical moments that have yet to come. But then also in a meta way, apply to an overall problem that's encompassing the world from now until a certain time. In this instance, what it seems to me to be saying immediately, the text immediately says that when the Freemasons come to Ecuador and decimate it, which they did, they're going to profane the churches, and they did. This is the first thing Freemasons will do is they'll, back then at least, now they're just kind of guys drinking beers, but more or less, but the higher you go, the more nefarious and Luciferian it gets. But back then, they were looking to overthrow governments in the church. They'd break into churches, they'd kill priests, they'd imprison them, they'd crack open the tabernacle and just scatter Jesus' body everywhere, step upon it, desecrate it, use it in their rituals, all that stuff for profanation. Basically, it's kind of like quasi-Satanism, really. So I think that's what it first refers to. But I think it also can be a prophecy of a problem that would start, again, in the latter half of the 20th century that still perdures, that no one wants to talk about because I don't know why, other than, I guess, fear of repudiation or something, but I'm going to talk about it. We believe that the Eucharist is more than just bread. To put it quite starkly, you could make you could prop up the premises like this, like it's God or it's not, or it's God or it's just bread. The Protestants, even if you go to a communion service or if they call it Holy Eucharist or whatever, if you go to like a higher liturgical Anglican situation, they'll call it the Eucharist, but you and I both know that they don't actually have the authority to confect the Eucharist because they don't have a valid priesthood. No one else does besides the Catholic Church. This is why also you can't receive communion in other churches. Because it's not real. And when you receive communion in another church, you're saying, I'm in communion with you and everything that you teach and that you say. And if it's a Protestant church and you're Catholic, they don't believe in what you believe. They're in many situations, especially in the South, they are anti-Catholic. So it's like you're taking into yourself a lie almost when you receive communion in other denominations. We believe, because it's true, that we have the Eucharist because we have the priesthood, because Christ gave us the priesthood and the Eucharist. That it's the body, the blood, the soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And I want you to think about what I'm about to say very carefully. There is no substantial difference between Jesus in Mary's womb, Jesus on the cross, and Jesus resurrected and glorified in heaven, and Jesus in the Eucharist. Same Jesus, right? Exact same Jesus. There's no substantial difference. But there is an accidental difference, meaning there's a difference in its, you might say, its mode of presentation. The accidental difference is this. Jesus in the Eucharist is in the form of what? Bread, but still substantially Him. Hence why we say that He's hidden under the appearance, under the guise of bread. And as the church has always immemorially taught, He's there, fully present, body, blood, soul, divinity, even in the smallest visible particle. Here's the church saying this through the ages. Council of Florence, 1500s, and every part of the consecrated host, the Eucharist, or the consecrated wine, the blood, when separated, the whole Christ is there. So that means that if I took a host, and for example, what do I do right before I consume communion? I fracture the host in half, right, over the chalice. Why? Because if I do it over here, the particles are going to go everywhere because it's a piece of whole wheat. So you fracture it over the chalice, take your finger, you run it down, all the particles onto it. I've taken my host, the principal host, the celebrant's host, I've broken it into two. Does that mean I have 50% Christ here, 50% Christ here? No. There's still 100% Christ, still 100% Christ. So he's still present in the parts. So by logical extension, if I were to keep breaking that same host, it's still the whole Christ in each piece, all the way down to a tiny particle. That's what we believe as Catholics. That's what they're saying here. That's what the Council of Florence is saying. The body of our Lord is contained whole and entire under the least particle of bread. This is the catechism from the Council of Trent in the 1500s. The Eucharistic presence of Christ endures as long as the Eucharistic species subsists, as long as it still looks like bread or a piece of bread, or looks like wine or a little drip of wine. Christ is present whole and entire in each of the species, and whole and entire in each of their parts, in such a way that the breaking of the bread does not divide Christ, as I just said. Church fathers, partake of it, but be sure not to lose any of it. For if you lose any of it, you would clearly suffer a loss, as if it were one of your own limbs. Tell me, if anyone gave you gold dust, would you not take hold of it with every possible care, ensuring that you would not drop any of it or suffer any loss? So will you not be more cautious, much more cautious, to ensure that not a crumb falls away from that which is more precious than gold or precious stones? St. Cyril. Do not regard as bread that which I have given you, but take, eat this bread, and do not tread upon its crumbs. For what I have called my body, that it is indeed. One particle from its crumbs is able to sanctify thousands of thousands and is sufficient to afford life to those who eat of it. St. Ephrem. This is before the 500s here, these two guys. In conclusion, in the smallest particle is the actual flesh and blood of Christ. And because in the Eucharist, he's in the form of bread, he's left himself with us in a more vulnerable and a more fragile state now than he was when he walked upon the earth. The conclusion is simple. Therefore, we should take care to protect him. He didn't leave us himself in the form of bread and wine so we could carelessly scatter him about. Because if what I'm telling you holds, which is what the church is telling you too, every time we lose a particle, it's a piece of him going somewhere, right? This is also why we use a corporal. That's that 6, it's that one, 9 kind of folded piece that comes out before the Eucharist. The corporal comes from corpus because it's upon which the body sits, the Corpus Christi sits. And also the chalice sits too. It's in case any particles go anywhere by my own kind of just error, or the priest error, that at least the corporal catches it. And underneath that, we've got 3 linens, 3 layers of altar linens in case anything is spilled or any kind of particles get on those linens. Those linens are regularly and carefully cleaned so as to avoid any particles falling off when they're folded up or when they're soaked in water. Same with the corporals. Same with the purificator. The reason why we purify vessels, at least we did forever until they changed the laws, and there's just no rules for purification. Why you see some priests do some things, some priests do other things, and some priests do nothing. It used to be you had to first pour wine into all the vessels you just consumed from or distributed from, because if you look inside of a vessel, you're going to find intact on the walls of that ciborium or that chalice, little tiny, not a few, but many little tiny, probably 1,000 or so particles all around it. That's still him. And if you use wine first, the wine more easily breaks off those particles from adhering. Water makes it all just go mush, and then it just gets really nasty. So you go wine first, into the chalice, you consume the wine, then you go back again with your fingers over, because you got particles on your fingers, with wine and water. Do the same thing again, consume again. That virtually gets rid of all of the little particles of his flesh. That was how every priest purified every vessel for, I guess, about 1,800 years at least, until 1970. So now we have an issue where in 1970, the Dutch-speaking bishops in the northern part of Europe, they started introducing this practice called communion in the hand, which is what we're all taught if we go to grade school up to this day. I was taught this when I was in CCD, where you walk up and you put your hands up like this, and usually it's like left over right, and you receive from your left hand into your mouth from your right. So you communicate, you receive the host, and you communicate it yourself. That's the way we're all taught. And it's because it's grounded in this really, and it's not just erroneous, it's somewhat desecratory practice introduced by the Dutch bishops in the 70s. They started doing it, and the Vatican said, stop. This is not custom in the Roman Rite. You can't do this. This has no precedence in the Roman Rite. Communion in the hand was a thing for about 500 years, but I've said this before. Communion in the hand was when you walked up, you knelt down, you were incensed on some occasions, you'd purify your hands in water, then the priest would put left hand over right, put the host onto your hand, you'd lick your hand, you would never self-communicate, you'd lick your hand, and then you'd also lick it again for any particles there, and then you would go to the side and you would wash your hands again in a bowl, that way any particles adhering to your hands would go into the bowl. And that bowl would be probably set out for at least a day for those little particles to dissolve, no longer look like bread, then be poured upon the earth. That is not what we do today, my friends. Not at all. But it's kind of strange, right? Because we're all taught to do this. So where did it come from? Again, it came from these Dutch bishops who introduced this practice in disobedience. They kept doing it. The Vatican said, okay, we can't stop this practice. It's spreading through Western Europe. It's spreading to America. So they gave an indult. They gave permission for the practice. And in most conferences, the bishops had to decide based off a vote to all the bishops, do we want to do this or not do this? In America, it was actually quite overwhelming. We don't want to do this. But Bishop Bernardine, who was quite a guy, if you know anything about Bishop Bernardine, because he didn't get a favorable vote for communion of the hand, as I just mentioned, not in the old way, but in this new way, he started petitioning for, he made up votes from deceased bishops, and he got bishops who were retired to vote in the positive for the practice, thereby tilting the numbers in the vote. So now it's ubiquitous, it's common spread that communion in the hand is the standard. And like I said, it's what you're taught if you go to any Catholic school, you're in second grade or whatever for communion. But it's kind of crazy because we always receive communion everywhere in the Roman Rite from about the 600s or so, kneeling down on the tongue by a priest alone and with a little altar, what we call a hand paten in case any particles fell. I think I've got a picture. Yeah, here's a picture. This is not very long ago. This is only, judging by the haircut, it's either yesterday, because these haircuts are back in style, or it's probably like 1955-ish. Am I somewhere around there? Yeah?
62.
62? Okay, okay.
When I got first communion.
But these are girls receiving communion for the first time, doing the first communion, all at the altar rail. You got your server here with the hand paten underneath the chin in case it drops. Priest has his digits. You can see he's holding it like this. He has his digits together on the ciborium here, and he's distributing communion on the tongue. Everyone did this everywhere. No one cared. No one complained. No one complained that like people couldn't access the altar rail. If you could never access the altar rail, you would just stand and it was no big deal. Whatever, it happens. But for the most part, you would go up there and you'd kneel down. It's also nice too because the priest, when he has an altar rail in front of him, no matter how tall or how short the recipient is, it kind of levels everyone out and makes it a lot faster. And there's way less risk of dropping the species, whether in the hand especially, but also on the tongue. Sometimes it can be really tricky to get into someone's mouth way up here. It's way easier like this. And again, it's just what we did everywhere. And in the Eastern Rite, they receive standing. But here's what's different about the Eastern Rite. The Eastern Rite, they receive standing. What they really do is they walk up to the priest, who doesn't just distribute the bread, he distributes the bread dipped in the blood, the body in the blood, which is what you see here. There's if you can see here, there's little particles of the bread he has in this giant chalice. He's got this spoon. What he does, this is a baby. This has just been baptized and confirmed, receiving First Communion. They do this in the Eastern churches. You can receive communion before the age of reason. You do it once, and then you wait until your age of reason again, then you receive again. So you get all three sacraments as an infant. But he dips the spoon into the chalice, gets a little piece of the bread, so you get both species, and he puts it into your mouth like this. And what you don't see is this is a deacon here. Underneath here, because of the lighting, he's got a linen cloth in case anything would fall to the ground. So it's like, hey, yeah, I'm all about for communion standing. If we do this, if we still use some kind of something to keep particles from falling, or receiving again only in the mouth and from the priest, because the priest is the only one who can really take the diligence needed to make sure all the particles are properly purified. This is standing communion in the Eastern or the Orthodox churches. Again, always by intinction, so always on the mouth. You would never intinct and put it in someone's hand. That'd be horrifying. And then we had this practice. This is how far we've come from understanding what it is that we're holding as priests and what we're doing when we receive communion. I don't want to talk about this the whole time. I'm going to exhaust myself. But so here we have a priest, mask, whatever. I don't want to get into that conversation. But he's got a glove on, and he's distributing communion to people in the hand who either have gloves or don't have gloves, depending on what picture you pull up, And then it makes you wonder, well, what happens when he takes that glove off? I guess he does, takes the glove off. Surely there's particles all over that glove. Well, sadly, I'm sure they just go into the trash can. Not to mention anything that might be lost here in this process. There was always that thing where you had to reach out really far. It just became quite ridiculous. I don't want to comment on how I would have done things if I would have been around at that time, but we're at the point now where this is the standard, not this with the mask and the glove, but communion in the hand is the standard. This isn't a condemnation of anyone who does it. It's, again, what did I say in the beginning? This is all, in large part, the fault of priests not really knowing what they're doing, I think, like who they're holding and how fragile and vulnerable he is, but also it's just what you're taught to do by, again, your second grade teacher. Or you're probably told if you came about in the time when the Mass was just changing that, well, we don't do this anymore. I hear that all the time. I was told, Father, we just don't do that anymore. No, it's still on the books, but just no one does it. This just became common practice everywhere now. This is also how the Anglican Church forced communion in the hand whenever it swept through England as a way to make people not believe in the Eucharist. They said if we can make people eat the Eucharist like normal food, they'll stop believing in it. And it's quite curious that around 73%, if not more, of the average congregation of Catholics don't believe that Christ is actually present in the Eucharist anymore. And it kind of perfectly coincides with the introduction of this practice back in the 1970s and late 80s. A guy did a study actually on this, and he distributed communion to several people, some 200 times, if not more. And he did so with gloves for receiving and distributing. And he found that on average, there was 1.18 visible particles with normal hosts, the hosts that we use here. They have the pressed sides, that way there's less crumbs. And there was at least one fragment in every 70 times he distributed communion, at least one. On average, there was 1.18 visible. And if you use the ones that break up into all kinds of pieces, you get 100% of the time you get fragments. So on average, you have about 3 visible particles with those unlined hosts. Sorry, that should say lined in the sense that it's got all these divots in it that you can break into smaller pieces. So that's, again, every single time that communion is given, there are fragments lost. And if you're following what I'm saying, every little piece here is still him, because it's still a visible particle. This problem will never change until the bishops or the Pope decides it's time. And to me, I don't know how we can expect much of anything to go well for us as the church or a culture at large if we don't respect his body. I don't quite get it. It's the one thing we have that no one else has. and we treat him like common food. And you're despised and you're ridiculed if you try to show him reverence and adoration and receive in a traditional, worthy way. I want to reiterate, I am not condemning anyone who does this. I'm just telling you the data. So if no one's told you before, I'm telling you now, at least as myself as a priest, I know the church permits reception communion of the hand. Should it? That's a moral question. I mean, obviously, you could imagine what I'd say. Does it make sense from what I've told you? I don't think it makes any sense at all. Should we rebuild communion rails in churches? You better believe it. Should we kneel down for communion again? You better believe it. Should we receive on the tongue from only a priest again? Yeah, we definitely should. And until that happens, nothing will go well for us because it's him, and we mistreat him all the time. And mostly just out of ignorance. So if this isn't meant to be condemnatory, it's just calling to mind a very serious problem that no one seems to want to touch. No pun intended. And I think I have a very visceral image to follow, but if you're following what I'm saying too, and this is the most common practice, that means you get a lot of this. So what actually happens is that if each particle is actually a piece of his flesh or his blood, that means you have something like this effect going on at most masses. If you follow what I'm saying. And I know many people who won't follow what I'm saying. They don't want to follow what I'm saying. But just telling you what I'm saying. Again, my most holy Son will see himself cast upon the ground and trampled upon by filthy feet. All right, matrimony and vocations. As for the sacrament of matrimony, which symbolizes the union of Christ with his church, it will be attacked and deeply profaned. Freemasonry, which will then be in power, will enact iniquitous laws with the aim of doing away with the sacrament, making it easy for everyone to live in sin and encouraging the procreation of illegitimate children born without a blessing of the church. The Catholic spirit will rapidly decay. Again, this is our era she's describing. The precious light of faith will gradually be extinguished until there will be an almost total and general corruption of customs. Added to this will be the effects of secular education, which will be one reason for the death of priestly and religious vocations. Secular education. Here's some things that have changed in the past 50 years. We have no more mandatory fasting and abstinence laws on Fridays, nor custom of fasting on Wednesdays. There's no fast at all besides 2 days out of the year. There's no more ember days, which are also days of fasting that precede vigils. There's no more 40 hours devotion. I'm speaking in generalities here, but it's mostly the case. Generally speaking, there's no more First Friday, First Saturday devotions. There's no more Eucharistic processions, which we'll have one. Corpus Christi procession, we have a canopy. We're very excited to use it. I won't be here, sadly, but we're going to have a canopy for Corpus Christi Sunday. But you would have processions on days like Corpus Christi, Christ the King, Holy Thursday, Immaculate Conception, etc. You would do it once a year when you'd go around the entire premises of your parish or your parish boundaries. With the priest, you'd sing the litany of saints and psalms, and you'd bless the whole parish boundaries, which is both exorcistic and a blessing. Once a year, you'd do that. I mean, I've never seen that. No more family devotionals in large part, nor sacramentals in homes. Many homes, they're not even distinctively Catholic. You wouldn't know you're in a Catholic home. There's no crucifixes, images of the Sacred Heart, Immaculate Heart, holy water on the walls. All these things just it's really crazy, just kind of went away very quickly. No form of chaste courtship preceding marriage, and really just no marriage at all anymore. Most people just don't get married. They just cohabitate, as Mary said. They just live together and have illegitimate kids. There's no ritual way or cultural way of dating in a chaste way. There's no real interest in that, really. Again, if that's not done properly, it's very hard to create a healthy, chaste relationship in marriage if its beginnings were mired in mortal sin, of sexual sin. This is just a few things that came to mind as I sat down to type this out. We talked about decline in priests and nuns or religious. From 64 to 04, there were about 70,000 priests that left the ministry. They just left. Paul VI, actually, he was the Pope after the council. His secretary would say that for about 2 hours a day, I think, more or less, he'd be in his office just crying. Like, couldn't stop crying. Because he'd be signing off on laicization forms for priests who requested laicization, meaning they requested to be dismissed from public ministry, to be stripped of all of their priestly faculties, and be returned to the lay state, laicization. Every day, he'd just cry as he did this. 70,000. I think there were about 10,000 lost just from 65 to 70 or 75 too. So if we had a better graph in America, you could see that really sharp decline. Religious Sisters, as you can see, is really tanked, and it's still tanking. There doesn't seem to be any hope in sight for the restoration of like religious life at the scale that it was 50 years ago. I don't know what's going to come of that, but religious life, sisters and brothers and monks and nuns, they're the model Christians. They're the ones who live the vows: poverty, chastity, obedience to the extreme. Without them, we don't have a model to aspire to. We also don't have a cheaper Catholic education, because who do you think gave us all these Catholic schools? Those religious. And now we have to hire lay people to do it because there's no religious who want to do it, or because the religious, I guess, this is a narrative I hear now, that religious don't need to be teaching in schools, they need to be doing other things, as if that's like competition, right? Like they either can be in schools or not in schools. They can't both be in schools but also do other things too. But the laity should be working in schools. Well, I don't know about that, because, many of you have paid for Catholic education. It's expensive. And maybe some of you have worked for Catholic schools. It does not pay well at all. It's not a good system. And our numbers are plummeting across the board in the United States for Catholic schools. Attendance is going down. The overturn of teachers is constant. The number of Catholic teachers is far outweighed by the number of non-Catholic teachers in Catholic schools. It's a completely irretractable problem until we get more religious to run schools again. It would be free, and you'd be sending your kids to a school run by people who are actually Catholic and actually take religious life seriously. And you can't undo what I just said with one bad story of one nun who hit you that one time. Doesn't work, okay? There's always outliers on the margins. If you're being reasonable, I'm right. Wicked priests, okay. This is a theme in all the apparitions that all five. The sacrament of holy orders will be ridiculed, oppressed, and despised. For in this sacrament, the church of God and even God himself is scorned and despised, since he, Jesus, is represented in his priest. The devil will try to persecute the ministers of the Lord in every possible way. He will labor with cruel and subtle astuteness to deviate them from the spirit of their vocation, and will corrupt many of them. These depraved priests who will scandalize the Christian people will make the hatred of bad Catholics and the enemies of the Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church fall upon all priests.
Communist infiltration.
Bella Dodd made it very clear as an ex-communist. This is all on record. Again, it's it's just horrifying. But the Communist Party actually intentionally slipped guys into Catholic seminaries. I want to say back in the 40s is when it started. It wasn't just a post-conciliar thing. As a way, again, almost like in a Freemasonic way, to undo the church from inside out, to kind of poison it at the root. The extent of that, I don't have numbers at hand, but it's much more than you'd want it to be. One secret communist in the Catholic priesthood is bad enough, but there were many. There were hundreds, if not maybe on the thousands. I don't recall the numbers at hand, but that's an historical fact. And the attempt was that they would subvert Catholic custom and Catholic doctrine, because the communists are atheists. You have to be an atheist to be a communist. And if you don't get that, you don't actually know what communism is. Because communism is rooted essentially in Marxism. And Karl Marx said, if you want to be a Marxist, or if you want to follow this communist ideal, you have to be baptized in the river of Feuerbach. Feuerbach is a German philosopher. His name actually means fire brook, or like river of fire. So it's an image he's using very intentionally. And the baptism is a throwing off of your Catholic baptism or your Lutheran baptism and accepting a materialistic atheism. Because communism reduces everything to secularity and economic value. An individual only has value or worth or identity insofar as they're an economic unit, which is why all communism is ever about is money, 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 money. And how do we get more money to more people and take more money from richer people and give it to poorer people? There's no anything in view besides this dumb, banal, mundane world. It's atheistic through and through. So if you want to be a communist, you have to be an atheist. So the communists knew that if we can get communists into the church, we can kind of shift the tide and make the church more atheistic and more secular, more humanistic. And you can be the judge if that's happened. This is a quote from St. Anthony Maria Claret. It's actually a biblical idea that God's worst scourge he can put upon his people, apart from famine and plague and death, is bad shepherds. Because what's worse than losing your body? Losing your soul. And what does a bad shepherd do? He teaches you the wrong things about God and how to live. And we'll see that topic really just on full throttle, super magnified in Garabandal and La Salette. Here's St. Anthony Maria Claret. If you see a bad priest at the head of a parish, you should be afflicted and fear that perhaps our sins deserve such a horrible chastisement. This is a kind of interesting idea. It's like if you've got a bad priest, it's your fault, which I don't know if that's always the case in every situation. For sacred scripture teaches us that the greatest and most terrible scourges that God sends to a people is to give it bad priests. Until the wrath of the Lord reaches its apex, he permits that nations arm themselves one against the other, that the fields become sterile, that hunger, desolation, and death exert their dominion over the earth. So all natural evils, right? However, but here's the really bad one. When his indignation, his just nature, reaches its climax, when God is like maximally mad, he sends the last and most atrocious of his punishments by allowing unfaithful ministers, stained priests, scandalous shepherds to appear among men. Then it happens that the abominations of the people are the cause of the bad priests, and the bad priests are the greatest punishment which God can chastise his people. More on wicked priests from Our Lady of Quito. This apparent triumph of Satan will bring enormous suffering to the good pastors of the church, the good priests. The many good priests and the supreme pastor, the Pope and Vicar of Christ on earth, same thing, who a prisoner in the Vatican, so this idea that the Pope will be a prisoner in the Vatican, will shed secret and bitter tears, the Pope will, in the presence of his God and Lord, beseeching light, sanctity, and perfection for all the clergy of the world, of whom he is King and Father, the Pope is. Further, in these unhappy times, there will be unbridled luxury, which will ensnare the rest into sin and conquer innumerable frivolous souls who will be lost. Innocence will almost no longer be found in children, nor modesty in women. How the church will suffer on that occasion, the dark night of the lack of a prelate and father to watch over them with paternal love, gentleness, strength, and prudence. Let's pause. This is the next piece in the message, and I'm not quite sure how to interpret that first line. How the church will suffer on that occasion, the dark night of the lack of a prelate and father to watch over them. It seems to suggest a time in which there isn't a pope, or there isn't a valid pope. That's the suggestion here. So there's no pope, there's no prelate or father to watch over them with paternal love, gentleness, strength, and prudence. Many priests, in light of this, will lose their spirit, placing their souls in great danger. Pray insistently, incessantly, without tiring, and weep with bitter tears in the secrecy of your heart, imploring our celestial Father that for love of the Eucharistic heart of my most holy Son and his most precious blood, shed with such generosity and by the profound bitterness and sufferings of his cruel passion and death, he might take pity on his ministers, his priests, and quickly bring to an end those ominous times, sending to his church the prelate that will restore the spirit of its priests. So it's a weird idea that it suggests, I think quite plainly, there's a time when there's a pope who's not a pope, or there's not a pope, and that because of that, the priests will be like, well, what do we do? Which is what you should do if you're a priest. Because the pope is like he's the keystone that holds the whole hierarchical structure in place. I mean, you say his name in the Mass every day. So if you know that the Pope isn't the Pope, or there is no Pope. Like, whose name do you say when you say the Roman canon at Mass before you confect the Eucharist? Who do you follow? I mean, I guess you'd follow your bishop, because your bishop is like the supreme, he's kind of like the Pope in your area. But then there's no unifying thing to unite them. It becomes like the Orthodox Church, which has all these bishops that are like autonomous, and then all these priests that in due time become kind of like autonomous as well. So it seems to foresee an event in which that will happen. But at the end of it, God will give us a new Pope, a real Pope, a pious Pope, maybe a Pius the 13th or something. Yeah. So that's what seems to be indicated here. It's very interesting. During this unfortunate epoch, injustice will enter even here, my closed garden. This might be referring to the convent in which she's talking with Sister Mariana. But it could mean also the church at large. Disguised under the name of false charity, it will wreak havoc in souls. The spiteful demon, Satan, will try to sow discord, making use of putrid members. This is really intense. Who, masked by the appearance of virtue, will be like decaying sepulchres, emanating the pestilence of putrefaction, causing moral deaths in some and lukewarmness in others. It's interesting that Mary says that the principal way that this will come about is by a kind of false charity. Benedict XVI wrote an encyclical called Caritas in Veritate, which is charity in truth. To tell the truth to someone is an act of charity. How you do it, when you do it, is a matter of prudence. For example, if someone comes to me, this happens a lot. This is not really an example, this is real. Someone comes to me and they're afflicted and they're Protestant. My first thing out the gate isn't, my first thing out the gate actually, here's what I do. The reason why you're here is because I have authority and power, given me by Jesus Christ, passed on the apostles. Your Protestant minister doesn't have it, I have it. It's because I've received it through ordination, which we can trace in a pedigree. If the priesthood's real and I can really help you, that means the sacrament's real, that means you have to be Catholic. Plain and simple. And most of the time, that's all people need to hear. They're like, okay, that makes sense. And then they get better, and they're like, oh yeah, this priesthood thing's real, sacraments are real, I'll just become Catholic now. It's really simple. That's what Catholic faith is. You believe in apostolic succession, you believe in the sacraments, it'd be technically kind of foolish to not become Catholic. You could have reasons. I'm not saying the reasons aren't significant, but I don't start out the gate by like telling people that, if you've had an abortion, you're excommunicated from the church de facto. I don't start there, right? I don't start by laying down like moral hammers upon people. In time, we're probably going to get there. We're going to get to the point where we're going to talk about are you living in sexual morality? Are you drinking too much? Do you have no virtue? Do you wake up too late? Do you never pray? Have you ever felt sorry for any of the sins of your past? What are your relationships like? Do you have anger and vitriol for people who've hurt you in the past? So I'm going to get to the point where we're going to get to the truth of what's going on with you, but we don't necessarily start with the most intense kind of hammering. We don't do the hammer method. That said, to not give someone the truth, to not communicate the truth to someone about Jesus Christ and His church is not charity. It's harmful, actually, because the truth of the Catholic faith will set you free and will heal you. And if you adhere to it to your dying breath, you'll go to heaven, without which you won't, or you're at least in very grave risk of eternal separation from God. So we have the duty to share the truth with people. It's not just like a you're okay, I'm okay. That's subjectivism. It's not real. It's not right. We're the one true faith, and we have the obligation upon us to go out to the Protestants, to the Buddhists, to the Hindus, to the pagans, to the atheists, I don't care who they are, and our families, outside of our families, and evangelize them. The Pope said recently, this is very curious to me, he said it is illicit, this is me translating the Italian, to evangelize, meaning it's illegal to evangelize. He's wrong, okay? He's not speaking from his chair authoritatively, speaking from another chair for a Wednesday audience or whatever. it's just wrong. It is not illegal to evangelize. You have the obligation to evangelize. It's the Great Commission given by Christ to the apostles. If you don't do it, it's technically a sin of omission. If you don't share the truth of the gospel when you know you should, that's an obligation that we have. What is apostasy? There's 3 different types of mortal sins that deal with denying the faith. Here's one, heresy. Heresy is the obstinate denial or obstinate doubt after receiving baptism of some truth, some doctrine, some dogma, which is to be believed by divine and Catholic faith. There's 2 different kinds of heresy: material heresy and formal heresy. Material heresy, here's an example. If I asked anyone in this room to clarify for me how Jesus Christ is both perfectly human and perfectly divine in one person, I don't think anyone could do it besides maybe like one other person in the room. And you'd probably say something that's not quite right, that probably is like Nestorianism or Arianism or some kind of Apollinarianism. You'd probably give me some kind of heresy just because you don't know. But it's material. Doesn't make you a heretic formally. Just means there's a part of your catechesis that's kind of just not lacking or replete in that area. But I don't expect you to know that in great detail anyway. We'll get there eventually, but that's material heresy.
Bishops in Germany?
So a formal heretic is someone who knows the faith, like a bishop in Germany, or many bishops in Germany right now, and openly and obstinately denies it. So for example, the church's teaching on same-sex unions or homosexuality at the time of Paul is outdated. And the church has been it's been wrong for about, 2021 years. We've just got it wrong. But now we know. This is how you know. So anytime you hear that phrase, whether you're dealing with someone who doesn't know anything. But now we know, based off science. We love science. Science. Now we know, based off science, that human people have different kinds of ways that they love each other and like it. It's not always heterosexual love. Blah, blah, blah. It's nonsense. Doesn't make any sense at all. So that's heresy. So a German bishop saying, our teaching on marriage and heterosexuality in marriage, which is just obvious, needs to be changed, heresy. And when you do that, you actually separate yourself from the church automatically. So that's what's happening over there. Here's an example too, Martin Luther. When Martin Luther formally denied ministerial priesthood. So he said, I don't believe there's such thing as priests who can confect sacraments. I don't need a mediator between me and God. Heresy. Apostasy is the total and complete repudiation of the Christian faith, which is to say, you deny outright the reality of Jesus Christ. That's apostasy. Schism is the refusal of submission to the Pope or of communion with the members of the church subject to the Pope. Example, the Orthodox Church. They have valid sacraments, they have valid priesthood, but they do not subject themselves to the Pontiff in Rome, to Pope Francis now, to the Pope. The consequences of any of these mortal sins, and these are grave sins, is automatic excommunication, for which you need to go to confession. A reminder, if you're here, many of us are here in some way, you're not in grave mortal sin. This is the grave mortal sin here. This is just an error in judgment or ignorance. But this is persisting in what you know, like Martin Luther knew Catholic theology, and he denied it outright. So heresy, schism, and apostasy. There shall be scarcely any virgin souls in the world. The delicate flower of virginity will seek refuge in the cloisters. Without virginity, fire from heaven will be needed to purify these lands. This is our first and only instance in Quito of an idea of fire coming down from heaven, which is an image we will see evoked again in Garabandal more viscerally, more vividly. Sadly, this is definitely the case. Virginity is not prized. Saving yourself for marriage today you're an outlier if you do so. Hope for restoration. In order to free men from bondage to these heresies, those whom the merciful love of my most holy Son will destine for that restoration will need great strength of will, constancy, valor, and confidence in God. To test this faith and confidence of the just, There will be occasions in which everything will seem to be lost and paralyzed. This will be then the happy beginning of the complete restoration. So at some point, according to Our Lady of Quito, in the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, there will be a sense that all things are lost. That everything is just like stuck in a state of paralysis. Nothing's moving. It's like a body that's alive, but it can't move. The church, It's been paralyzed by heresy. It's been paralyzed by sin. It's been paralyzed by Freemasonry. But it's just when things are at their worst that we have hope for restoration to come. And here's how it will come. Hidden and beautiful souls who will labor with valor and disinterested zeal for the salvation of souls. Against them, the impious will rage a cruel war, hurling vituperations, calumnies, and vexations against them, in order to impede the fulfillment of their ministry. But they, like firm columns, will remain unswerving and will confront everything with the spirit of humility and sacrifice, with which they will be vested, by virtue of the infinite merits of my most holy Son, who will love them in the innermost of his most holy and tender heart. Whenever you trace really calamitous times in history, you will always, this is really cool, I just discovered this recently, you will always and in every case find a victim soul that's hidden away. That in spite of plague, famine, bad priest, bad shepherd, whatever, there's always a victim soul that Jesus has kind of stowed away to keep everything still afloat. And what I mean is there's someone chosen by Jesus who will suffer extraordinarily, usually with the stigmata, stigmata, sickness, can't eat, can't sleep, beaten by demons, dies on Friday, wakes up again late on Saturday or Sunday, every day, or every Friday for their entire lives, with visions, mystical stuff, all that stuff, but extreme suffering to make reparation for the evils being perpetrated by the church and by the world, and to keep the world and the church intact. A good example of this, which I wish I could get into, but I don't have any time, is Blessed Anna Maria Taigi, who was in Rome at the time of the Napoleonic conquest of Italy. Jesus said to her plainly, the politics, the economics, the kind of the land battles, that stuff, it's happening, but you're the reason why, Anna Maria, why this is all sticking together. Some little tiny woman with kids, with a stigmata, with mystical graces and extreme suffering, who everyone knew in Rome, is an extraordinary story, Anna Maria Taigi, Taigi. There's a book called Wife, Mother, Mystic. It's very, very, very good. She was the reason why the church and the world stayed afloat. She was the reason why Napoleon couldn't capture the Vatican. Anna Maria Taigi. So chosen souls are always the thing that Jesus stows away to keep civilization and the church afloat. And then the triumph of Mary. This then will mark the arrival of my hour, when I, in a marvelous way, who knows how, will dethrone the proud and cursed Satan, trampling him under my feet and fettering him in the infernal abyss, binding him in hell. Thus the church and country will finally be free of his cruel tyranny. Interesting. Mary puts the ultimate blame of all this on Satan, not on mere human will, but on preternatural will, on Satan and the demonic itself. She's also saying that the reason why the church and society are wayward is because of demonic enticement and affliction. Not just bad economics, not just bad circumstances of famine or disease or plague. No. The reason why things don't quite go right is because we connive with the demonic. We fall prey to their temptations. We sin. Bishops sin. Priests sin. Consecrated religious sin. Dad sin. Mom sin. Kids sin. The sin becomes it's like the gateway that allows disorder to enter into the church, into the world. But Mary says she's going to put her foot down on Satan, bind him up in hell, and that will be the beginning of her triumph. This is the same message we'll hear in Fatima too, that in the end her immaculate heart will triumph over Satan. All right, we're at the end of Quito. 150, isn't that crazy? Okay. So here's some prophecies that are important to kind of back up all this stuff I just read to you. Mary told Mariana that this is the 1600s, that papal infallibility will be declared a dogma of the faith by the same pope chosen to proclaim the dogma of the mystery of my Immaculate Conception. What pope was that? Pius IX. In Vatican I, he proclaimed the dogma of papal infallibility, and he also proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. So it's Mary kind of like leaving a very concrete data point that we can look to, 200, almost 300 years later, to resubstantiate what she's saying in the messages. She's doing this on purpose because she wants us to pay attention to the messages. So she's giving us historical things that will happen, that aren't things that just demons could guess, but they're like solid historical things that are good things with names and terms that Mariana had no idea what they meant. Infallibility, Immaculate Conception, these weren't phrases floating around in Ecuador in the 1600s. And as we see here, Pius IX, he defines those two things. Mary also said, in the 19th century, 200-ish years later, 300 years later, there will be a truly Catholic president, a man of character, whom God our Lord will give the palm of martyrdom on the square adjoining this convent. This man is this man, Gabriel Garcia Moreno. He was the first Catholic kind of prime minister or president of Ecuador. And what did he do? Gabriel, he consecrated the entire nation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which she said he would also do as well. He was like a great French Catholic king, It's like the ones that don't exist anymore. He was like a model king for Ecuador. And what happened to him? He was murdered. Who murdered him? Freemasons. I shouldn't laugh. Freemasons murdered him in the square adjoined to the convent, as Mary said it would happen. There you go, another historical data point that came to fruition. Here's a picture of, so you can see you have South America here in the globe in his left hand, and you have his Sacred Heart, and the beams from his heart, meaning grace, is being poured out upon South America. It's particularly, actually, if you look at it closely, it's particularly touching Ecuador right around here. And he's got his rod of justice and rule in his right hand, which means it's a great image because it's great for so many reasons, but at the end of the day, who's in control? Jesus Christ is in control. And Satan can do what he wants. The Freemasons can do what they want. But at the end of the day, he's the one who has his hand. The world is something he holds in his hand. And he holds also in his right hand the staff of judgment and of punishment on those who don't obey him. That's what that rod is for. It's meant to, in the Bible, it's the rod that the psalmist says that Jesus will use to smash pottery, meaning in the images that he's smashing nations. That's what that rod is for. It's meant to defeat his enemies. This image is all over Ecuador if you go to Ecuador. So in sum, here's what we have. Widespread moral corruption led by Freemasonry, profanation of the sacrament of matrimony, wicked priests who will scandalize the faithful and cause suffering for good priests, and maybe not a pope somewhere thrown in there, unbridled lust which will ensnare many souls, loss of innocence among children and loss of modesty among women, a lack of priestly religious vocations, and a period of catastrophe followed by a great period of restoration. Here's a picture, too, of Mary and Mariana and Jesus with his nice, long, auburn hair. I love this picture. A Spaniard definitely did this. This is definitely a Spaniard. Then we have Our Lady of La Salette. Well, it's 1:55. That was just one apparition. I will say this apparition is probably, in terms of, to me at least, in terms of value for now, that's why I spend so much. I spend a lot of time on it because I think it has a lot of value for now, precisely because Mary said these prophecies or this message pertains to the 19th and the 20th century, especially the last half of the 20th century. And that's the time that we just got out of. And it's so specific, and it kind of sets the tone for the apparitions to follow. La Salette, really La Fraude as well, which is I can't do them all, but La Fraude, La Salette, Fatima, Garabandal, and Akita. If you know Quito, you'll find that the messages that are particularly in Garabandal and Akita, they're not that unfamiliar, which is why I needed to start with this and lay the foundation. These same themes will appear. Chastisement coming first upon priests, because priests are bad, chastisement upon priests, an apostasy in the church where the church starts to itself, like its own prelates, its own bishops and cardinals and priests deny Christ and try to reform the church for itself. You find an attack on marriage, and also a hope of restoration by chosen souls that have been kind of, as I said, stowed away underneath the ship for when things get really bad, and they'll come out and kind of fight for us. I'll do just the very beginning part of La Salette. So you notice the first thing you see in this image is how Mary's postured. And this is how the children saw her. When they were tending their sheep, they saw a woman, beautifully radiant and clothed, weeping bitterly. And here's the context. This happened again in what? 1846. 1846. The French Revolution finished in 1792. Imagine, this is like, what, 50-ish years after the complete overthrowing of the most Catholic nation in the world, and that's France, by the revolutionaries. The French Revolution was built upon Enlightenment ideals. And the Enlightenment is thoroughly atheistic, through and through. It's, again, like I said earlier, it's humanistic, it's secular. It wants that separation of man from God, because God and man are like oil and water. Or God and man, it's not a relationship of it's not synergistic. The idea is that God actually suppresses man's nature. He doesn't fulfill it, as Irenaeus would say, where man is fulfilled in becoming like Christ. That's not the ideal of the Enlightenment thinkers, many of whom were either like marginally Protestant or atheist. Think of people like Voltaire, for example. If you ever read Voltaire, there's a few people who hate the Catholic Church more than Voltaire. But these ideas sweep through France and lead to the complete decimation of the Catholic Church in all of France. Again, the most Catholic country that ever existed since the beginning of Christendom in the early Middle Ages. The Civil Constitution on Clergy. This was issued in 1790, and what it did is it actually it separated the church from the state, which to us sounds good, but in this case it wasn't good, because there was a nice harmony of the church and the state for a long time in France, whereby everything that the church owned, its parishes, its schools, its convents, its hospitals, lost all subsidy. So like all these schools closed, all these convents closed, all these religious vocations were lost, all these priests left because they had no more money. They had to basically be run by lay people. They had to reestablish all these things by really just lay kind of generosity, which eventually worked out, but it took a long time. So it was a complete kind of hacking away at the whole economic and social structure of the church at the time. It was very effective. Here we have a picture of the desecration of Notre Dame Cathedral. I don't know if you know this, but part of what happened at the very end of the French Revolution is there was a parade taken into Notre Dame, which is the cathedral in Paris that recently caught on fire, and they're restoring it. I think, are they doing it properly, or are they going to make it all modern and nasty? Yeah, okay. It's good. But what they did is oh, you know what? That's actually kind of perfect in a way, because what the revolutionaries did by force, now secularists and pseudo-Catholics can do by convenience. So it's like what a fire caused naturally, it's like now they can finally make Notre Dame and all of its, Gothic, oppressive, draconian stuff, they can just kind of do away with it, make it all nice and modern and fresh and inspiring, and I'm sure it'll be leaking within 10 years, and it'll have glass everywhere and plants in strange places, and it will completely shift all the focus off the high altar and the tabernacle, if there's even a tabernacle anymore. It's effectively what I'm about to describe, which is when, at the Revolution, these are everyday people, all of whom would have probably been Catholic before this. They walked in Notre Dame, which means Our Lady. They toppled over the statue of Notre Dame, of Our Lady, of Mary, and they erected a statue of Lady Reason in its place. So here's a man triumphantly with his foot on one of the statues of one of the bishops here. You can see his body's been cut in half. See his mitre there. So it's a very defiant kind of, this is humanism. This is man taking his stand against the oppressive church, against papacy. So this was erected in the church for quite a while, actually. It was a statue of Lady Reason, which is a goddess. It's basically, if you could take reason or rationality, which scientific atheistic types love to love to make into a god. If you could take that and make it into a statue, that's what they did. So it's idolatry. It's an abomination. It's much like the abomination of desolation that's foreseen in Samuel when someone would go into the high temple and rip out the Holy of Holies and erect pagan gods. This happened here in Notre Dame, 300 years ago or so, or 200 years ago or so. So imagine that as a Catholic. Like this is fresh in your mind. This is if it's 1860, this is not very long ago. Imagine if this happened in the cathedral downtown. 60 years ago. Imagine that happened. That would still be something you talk about once in a while around the dinner table, probably, especially if you're a good Catholic. Then you have, of course, the July Revolution, which is a 3-day overthrow of the king. I can't remember his name right now. Brain's getting to the point of exhaustion. But then you have Emile Combes. Emile Combes was elected president, and he effectively in 1901, so this is at the end of the apparitions, or at the end of the era, he completely just decimated Catholicism with more stuff like this, which suppressed the clergy and religious, and completely undid the church and the state, even more so than it was before. So this is a snapshot from 1780 to 1901, and then our apparitions occur kind of right in the middle, 1850, 1860. Here are our visionaries. Melanie, and I'm not going to try to speak in French, I really can't. Maximin or something like that, I'll say Max. So you have Melanie there, who I think would have been about 11, and then Max, who would have been about 8 years old. And they were devout, uneducated shepherds. As I said before, this tends to be the kind of person Mary likes to talk to, not bishops, sometimes priests, religious, who are humble and submissive, but also just little kids. She loves to talk to little kids. She particularly likes little poor kids who don't know much, but who go to Mass and they pray the rosary. Maybe they're not do it every day, but they have that kind of simple childlike faith. She loves childlike faith. She appears to them on September 19th. It's a one-day apparition. It's in the course of just a few hours in 1846. It details the calamities that will befall France and the church. And in doing so, this is a new thing, not found in Quito, she tells each of the seers, or the visionaries, a secret. Each of them, their own secret, which we'll get into. And here's another picture of her, and we'll stop. They were tending the sheep. I'll tell the story and I'll stop. I won't get to the message or the secret. They were tending sheep. Melanie was by herself, a little bit older, And this little boy runs up, Max, and he wants to hang out with her. And like any almost teenage girl, young boy, it's like, just leave me alone. And she tries to get away from him. But he's like, no, I want to play. And she's like, I don't want to play. Just leave me alone. But eventually they kind of sit down and they eat together. And then all of a sudden, as they're tending their cows, because there's little shepherd kids again, they see this bright kind of sun-like thing appear on a hill, and it's like radiant. They said it looked like the sun came out of the sky and rested upon this hill. And before they knew it, this thing suddenly evolved into this image, an image of a lady dressed in white with a rose diadem, which is a cool description too. Melanie said that the roses, she said, they're not like roses I've ever seen. She's like, I don't know how to describe them. She said, as I looked at them, they were being constantly replenished and replaced by new roses. It's kind of a cool image. And whenever I've talked to people who've seen Mary in any kind of mystical experience, that's how they actually always, the flowers always come up. That there's some kind of flowers that I've never seen before that I can't even describe to you, neither their color nor their form, but I'm pretty sure they're flowers, and there's just too many to even begin to look at. That's always a description of people who see. I think it's a good, genuine test of a Marian apparition or a vision of Mary is the flowers. It's kind of cool to think about. But she's sitting there, and she's weeping bitterly. And Max said later, he said, she looked like a mom who her children had beaten and then left. That's Max's description of what she looked like a mom who'd been beaten by her kids, verbally and physically, and then they ran away. So she's just distraught. That's Mary's disposition. This is how Mary decided to reveal herself in that first moment to these kids. And that's very, very, very important, because Nothing in these apparitions is accidental. It's not just random details. Like how she looks, what she wears, the flowers, her crying, the words she says, all of it's meant to communicate something. And as we'll see, it's that she's distraught. She's distraught and she's angry. And we'll see why whenever we do this again, if we can. All right, so it's 2:06. Any questions about anything? Let's do questions for about 10, 15 minutes. Yeah.
Do you have any comments about where the current situation in Ecuador falls in the prophetic sort of timeline? Because it's a horrible mess down there. And
It is, yeah.
people are fleeing up here.
Right.
They're communist, I just wondered if you had any insight on that.
Mary said that this convent will always remain as a sanctuary. I didn't give all the message, no. But Mary said this place where she's appearing in Quito, this will always be a sanctuary where I'll be present. She did say that. So we know that it has, what I take that to mean is this place will last until the end of time. Like the end of time. So it has that place has some real spiritual density to it.
Well, would this be like what you said, where it seemed like there was no hope and was paralyzed?
Oh.
Ecuador and that.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. So, like I said, the vision has different layers to it simultaneously. The prophecy does. Same thing with the prophecies in Scripture in Matthew, when Jesus is just going through there will be earthquakes, calamities, wars, people will be taken, people will stay behind. It's it immediately looks just like when Rome came and they sacked the temple, but it also looks like all kinds of iterations of other things too, but also like a grand event that will encompass everything. So in this, I'd say that same principle applies here. It probably specifically refers to Ecuador at this time, perhaps, but also probably has some other applications, some other country or the world or some other continent, the church at large.
It's a principle of things.
Yeah, you have to, which is why you have to be careful when you look at this stuff, because you don't want to just immediately, if you read it superficially, you'll just say, well, it's clearly now and for us. But as you point out, it's it could be referring particularly to the political moment now, or the religious moment now in Ecuador itself. So there's always these layers you want to try to be attentive to simultaneously. Or else you'll get, what usually happens is you get too wrapped up in now being it. But that's not really the case until it is the case. And then if it's it, you'll know it's it.
So it's typological.
I was afraid it's not to do anything to swallow the host but now I
Uh-huh.
see people chewing it.
You can, yeah. I've heard this before too, actually. My back hurts. You don't have to be scrupulous about that. You don't have to worry too much about that. It's fine to chew the host. Yeah. I would say what be careful for is being mindful of before you eat something again after you've consumed. You'll probably still, it happens to me, I can still feel bits of I can taste it. I can taste the sugar from the dextrose from the bread or whatever, So it's still him, up in my molars or something like that. So be attentive to how quickly you come to the donut time and eat a donut. That's what I would say. I have nothing against donut time. It's just if donut time takes precedence over, wait, I just ate God, maybe I should stay in the church for a little bit and pray, wait for it to decompose in my mouth, him to decompose in my mouth, then go to donuts. That's what I would be attentive to. But in terms of chewing and swallowing, it can be kind of cumbersome to let it just sit in your mouth and slowly, I guess. Okay, I know what you mean. You got the right instinct. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, we actually don't know what he did. It's not obvious because when you look at the text, this is going to feel like a setup question, but it's not to everyone else in the room. The word used in Greek for take is I might spell this right, lambanane, which in Latin is accipite, which sounds like what? Accipite, accept. I'm not sure why in English we get take. So,
Intake.
yeah, but it's the same word used when Jesus breathes the Spirit upon the apostles and says, receive the Holy Spirit. Same word. So, Saint Lambanane, receive it. So it might just be the case that Jesus gave the communion on the tongue. We don't know. There's a lot of old frescoes and paintings in the early Renaissance and earlier of the apostles on their knees receiving from Jesus himself. And what he's doing is he's intincting, just like the Orthodox do without a spoon. But he's taking the body and he's intincting it in the dish or the chalice. And he's putting it in the mouths of the apostles. There's actually, I think this is recorded in the visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, I believe, that they got on their knees and they immediately, the same way that they got on their knees when they first met him, when they saw him because they knew it was God. Well, it's like, well, this is him too, and I'm about to consume him. It's like they just got on their knees and they fell down and opened their mouths. We don't know for sure. It could be the case that that he passed the bread that he consecrated around, because they're apostles, so they can actually touch the species because they've been consecrated to do so, because they're the priests. So just like I can touch the species because I have to communicate, so they could have as well. But there is a tradition of them receiving by intinction on the tongue. And there was something else I wanted to say about that. But
Did you also, Father, at one time make the distinction that Judas dipped his own?
yeah, so you could say that. I'm still wrestling with this Greek text, but what's interesting is that I want to say it's in Matthew and John that one of them asks, well, who will betray you, Lord? And in one of them he says, he who dips with me into the dish is the one who will betray me. So it's the idea could be, this is my interpretation, this is not the church's teaching. This is to the recorder. You don't have to believe this. But it could be that Jesus is saying the one who communicates himself without letting me communicate to him is the one who will betray me. So it's like your first instance of not receiving. You're trying to take him, not receiving him or accepting him. And so in the Latin Mass, which I shouldn't really say that, the Roman Rite is in Latin, and then it's translated into the vernacular wherever you are. But the Latin text, which is the original text, it says accipite et manducate. Take this and eat, or accept this and eat, rather. So this is still what we say in Latin, which has more force than what we say in English or in Spanish or in any other language. So this is why you can hold that they received maybe on the mouth, even the apostles themselves.
To her point, in John 6:56, the Greek is null. I mean, it's pretty
Oh, yeah.
intensely. Because I know a lot of
Yeah.
cradle Catholics struggle with this, because they were told to let it dissolve or whatever.
Oh, I
I've
see,
heard-
I
I've
see.
heard that.
We were taught that by the nuns.
I've heard that too.
Don't chew, just dissolve. But then they changed.
Okay.
But
I don't.
The word is null.
Yeah.
It's-
Tragone, yeah. Tragane, yeah. That's it. So she's making the point that, in John 6, he says, unless you gnaw on the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. So he's using the analogy of how animals eat food. So its analogy only goes so far, because it has a certain kind of visceral messiness to it intentionally to really make his point. But you could certainly read it as saying, yeah, it's okay to actually chew. Yeah. Nothing wrong with chewing.
15.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll do 5 more minutes because I'm a nice guy. Yeah. Did they have them here? Okay.
Not ever here.
Yeah, the issue now is it's such a, at least it seems to me, I don't really know, but it seems like kind of a somewhat Herculean architectural task to put up altar rails again or put them in for the first time. I know that it's not like crazy expensive. I mean, you could even just get simple a wooden beam. Randy could make it, Emily's husband, just to go across. But there's also the issue here, though, is the height of the step it would need to be, the step is really sharp it's like this, and it would need to somehow be rounded off. That way people won't cut themselves or something like that. And some kind of padding could be put down. It could be done, definitely, but like I said, I don't think you will ever see that happen, which would be the necessary part to make this really widespread, unless it comes from top down. We're doing this now. We're going back to how we've always done it. So until the custom or until the discipline changes, the architecture won't follow suit. That's the best way to put it. Yeah. Well, let me go with someone else. Okay, George. Yeah.
I know you can't have just part of Jesus. I get that. But is there any plan to bring back the blood here at Corpus Christi?
There's actually strict laws that govern when the chalice can be distributed and when it can't be. The first law that governs it actually isn't a direct law. It's the principle that you shouldn't have extraordinary ministers unless you absolutely need them. So that's another thing that we just don't. I really think the best way to put it, and I don't attribute malice, we just don't care about it. In general, most priests just don't care. I mean, I could bring them in here, they just say, whatever, we should just not worry about this stuff. But I think it really matters that those who distribute consecrated things, whether it be touching consecrated vessels like chalices or ciboria, have consecrated hands. It's interesting, too, that in the ritual for holy orders, when a bishop would make you a priest, what did he consecrate on your hands? These 4 fingers. He did your palms, and then he dipped chrism on these fingers. We call these the canonical digits. And what's the thing that the priest always had to do after he touched the species, after he said the hoc est in corpus meum? He kept these fingers together. Again, this is immemorial custom until 1970. So this is related. It might seem like I'm kind of deviating, but we need to recover first the idea that there are things that I can touch and things that you can't touch. And it's not because I don't want you touching things. It's because the things have real value and meaning. And if you can't walk into a museum and touch a painting. It's like, but to give the counter argument its due, you might say, well, listen, Jesus, you could surely touch Jesus when he walked around, right? I mean, Galilee. And I'd say, well, maybe. There's actually no instances of anyone touching him. And the one instance someone does, he says, don't touch me. That's when Mary Magdalene tries to hold on to him after he's resurrected from the dead. He's like, don't touch me. I haven't gone to my Father. It's kind of a weird thing. Or the lady who has the hemorrhage, she just touches the hem of the garment, the tassel. Doesn't touch him. And it also neglects the fact, like I said earlier, he's in a different mode now for us than he was when he walked around. He's more vulnerable and fragile now. He's in the form of bread, therefore we should be careful with him. And he's in the form of wine, which is very prone to spilling. There was a terrible instance. Again, I'm not assigning any blame, but I think it was at First Communion at St. Mary's. I think this past cycle, that last year now, and the little girl spilled all the blood all over herself, and she was horrified, as she should be. And I'm sure it went all over the ground, and somehow the dress wound up here, and I think we soaked it. I think Debbie and Emily helped with that. But we soaked it, we got all the blood out, and then it was washed. But it's just like, the reason the church restricted the distribution of the chalice about 1,000 years ago to the laity is first because there was all these heresies that didn't accept that you get the full Christ in one species, which you're saying, obviously, you hold, which is the Catholic position. But also, it's just risk of spilling. And also, you got to have all these priests if you're going to be distributing the chalice, too. So it just became kind of cumbersome. So I guess what I'm saying is there's no easy answer. There are criteria. For example, there's a document called Memoriale Domini, which treats, and Redemptory Sacramentum, 2 documents which treat on the distribution of Holy Communion. It's also in the general structure of the Roman Missal. And it says, I think, at the top of my head, that you can do it twice. That's Corpus Christi Sunday, and I think Christmas and Easter, and possibly for a nuptial mass.
222.
What was that?
222.
I'll go to 225. But I'll be fine. But
Now we know why you get to be late.
yeah, this is why I'm late, perpetually late. But
Holy Thursday, Father?
yeah, maybe Holy Thursday. So there's like 5 instances where you can distribute it. Other than that, it's like don't do it. Certainly not every day, and it's still keeping in mind the principle that you really need to have priests distributing communion in either species. Or deacons. So it used to be this. It used to be priests or ordinary ministers, and deacons were extraordinary ministers. So if you lived in a parish like this where you had, let's say it's St. Mary's in 1920, you probably had like 10 priests in that rectory. So what the priests would do is they'd have mass publicly like once a month. The rest of the masses would be private masses because there's so many priests. The pastor would really have the principal mass, like maybe 11 o'clock. Well, 2 other priests would come down from the rectory, put on a surplice and a stole, and they would distribute with him just for distribution. So you always had ministers, ordinary ministers of Holy Communion. You always had priests everywhere to help. And if you didn't have priests, the deacons could assist as well. So anyway.
They also gave out communion before Mass.
They would. That was
I
all.
witnessed that.
That was a practice too, which has a long standing in the church too, where you could receive communion prior to a Mass. For example, on Holy Saturday, generally speaking, you would go to the Vigil Mass. This is complicated, but you'd go to the Easter Vigil around like 11 a.m., but they'd have distribution of Holy Communion around like 7 a.m. at like 3 different times, like 7, 9, and 10 o'clock. And the idea was that your obligation to receive communion was once a year, during which season? The Easter season. So this is everyone's chance to come and receive if they haven't received yet. And then you could stay for the Easter Vigil Mass itself, or you could go to Easter Sunday Mass the next day. But it used to be that we had to have all these distributions throughout the day on weekends because, thankfully, there were so many people who wanted to receive communion. We couldn't do it all in one Mass. So it wasn't like we're trying to separate the Eucharist from the Mass. That's the nonsense you'll hear from, I'll just say, certain theologians. They just don't understand like the history or the custom, but it's just because there were so many people who wanted to receive and who could receive, and there was only so much time in a day and only so much time in a Mass. Mass that reaches about 3.5 hours is for us, it's a lot. It's not like that anymore, but used to be that like Easter Vigil, you'd be there for 3.5 hours, and you might have 1,000 people.
I served those Masses.
Yeah, and as a priest, you can only have like coffee and tea beforehand, maybe some kind of small meal to kind of maintain your strength, but it was rigorous back then. Anyone else?
With a prayer?
Yeah, okay, I got you. Okay, I'm sorry. And if you have more questions, you can email Ashley the questions. She'll funnel them to me, and we'll try to do this again. I really want to hit Garabandal. I just have a very deep love for that. So maybe what I'll do is, most people know Fatima. Maybe I'll just bypass Fatima or do that whole weird third secret has it been revealed thing. Go straight into Garabandal. But we'll see if we can do it either later in May or the beginning of June. We'll have data or details about it to come. All right, we'll say a Hail Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Benedictio omnipotentis Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, discipula vos et maniat semper. Amen. Go in peace. See you guys.